Anyway, I'm glad to have you all here. My name is Lucille Boom, and I'm a librarian with San Jose Public Library. Before I welcome our speaker today, I need to make a few announcements. As I mentioned, please submit your questions by chat. As time permits, we will try to answer these before the end of the program. The program is going to be recorded for later and later archived on our website. You may change your name if you want under participants to protect your privacy. Those of you who received our invitation may have had our virtual programming survey at the bottom of the invitation. We will also bring this up at the end, and we'd appreciate it if you could fill it out. Our speaker today is Libby Copeland. She's an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, New York Times, New Republic, Esquire, and Wall Street Journal. That's quite a lot. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published this year in March by Abrams Press. The Lost Family explores a rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family, ourselves, and its ramifications for American life, broadly speaking. The Wall Street Journal describes it as a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. According to the Washington Post, The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Libby, welcome. DNA testing is a fascinating subject. How did you come to write this book?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and it's lovely to be here, Lucille. The book started as an article for the Washington Post. It ran in 2017, and the article was about a fascinating woman named Alice Playbuke, who happens to be on the chat today, which is quite a treat. It started because of a conversation I had with my editor at the Washington Post. I had been writing more and more about science and the intersection of technology and how we behave and how technology changes us. And I was particularly interested in sort of the inadvertent consequences of a recreational technology like DNA testing. So this idea that a product that's relatively inexpensive, that's billed as a form of entertainment, can have this unexpected outcome that is truly profound in terms of how we see ourselves, how we understand our families, and sort of the culture at large. These sort of consequences of an unexpected DNA result can kind of play out over a lifetime. So I wrote a story about Alice's journey, which I can talk about in a few minutes, for the Post. And I created like a Gmail address because I thought, well, I know there's other stories out there. Let me see what I can do about gathering them. I think I called it like DNA testing stories at gmail.com. And I signed in, a couple days after the Post story ran. The Post story kind of went viral and it was reprinted in other newspapers. And I was completely flummoxed by the number of emails I got. It was like hundreds and hundreds of emails. Emails from people who were longtime genealogists and emails from people who had very little interest in genealogy and had tested on a whim because they got this, DNA test kit as a gift from somebody and they just decided, okay, I'll spit in a vial and see what happens, and had experienced something really profound as a result. And that's sort of like how I came to realize that I really wanted to write a book about this broad phenomenon. I wanted to go back and revisit Alice's story. I wanted to travel to Washington State and interview her and go back 100 years because there was 100 years of historical research that was required to really understand her story. And I also wanted to tell so many other stories from the people that had reached out to me and people that I found in my reporting about the different groups of folks who are impacted by DNA testing and the way that it's changing how we see ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, home testing kits have been available for about 20 years. Tell us about the sort of industry of how home DNA testing started from what you've been able to research.
Yeah, so DNA testing as an industry is just about exactly 20 years old. The first company in the US was started, they sent out their first kits in April of 2000. So it was started by a genealogist, a man named Brennett Greenspan. He started a company called Family Tree DNA, which if you're heavily into this world, you've certainly heard of them if you haven't tested with them. And the original DNA tests were very different than what you experience now if you test. They were cruder, more expensive, and the type of DNA that was being tested couldn't tell you as much as the test can tell you now. The kind of DNA testing that we're talking about now is called autosomal DNA testing, and that can tell you about immediate genetic relatives. So, everything up to third, fifth cousins, sometimes even farther out. And when you test, you either spit into a vial or you swab your cheek, and you get basically two sets of results. One is this list of genetic relatives, which are other people in the database who are related to you, and the system can kind of tell how you're related by looking at overlapping genetic segments. And the other thing that you're looking for, which is probably the way that it kind of became mainstreamed and the thing that people most associate with DNA testing, are these ethnicity estimate pie charts, which say you're 13% Italian and you're 20% Korean. Alice's journey started through a pie chart. She tested in 2012. It was really very much the dawn of autosomal DNA testing. Ancestry, which is now the big sort of elephant in the room in this industry with the biggest database, had just unveiled its DNA test. It was still in beta, and she took advantage of an offer to test. And she was expecting a pie chart that was all basically one color. It was going to be almost entirely of Irish descent with British Isles and some Scottish. And in fact, what she got was a pie chart that was split in two. It was half what she expected, and it was half Ashkenazi Jewish. I think I can say that she was confounded. It sort of launched on what I would describe as an existential genetic detective mystery that would ultimately take her 2.5 years to unravel. But all of this started, as an industry, as sort of the gleam in the eye of a man who was a genealogist who did not see this product as being particularly appealing to anyone aside from people precisely like him. It started as a kind of a wild idea that nobody thought would be particularly successful, if you hear him tell the story. It started with him sweet talking a scientist at a university and trying to convince the guy to sell him some kits. And he told me that he would go to these conferences in the early 2000s with this product, this DNA testing product that's going to revolutionize your family history research. And he would try to convince people that this was relevant to genealogy. And people were like, what are you talking about? And he said his technique was he would go up to genealogists and he would say, let me tell you about, my name is Brennett Greenspan and I'm going to shake your hands. And he would talk. And as he would talk, he would hold on to their hand and he would walk backwards in an attempt to coax them back to his little cubicle so that he could show them the product. It took a very long time for this to kind of get off the ground. And yet, if you were to look at a graph of sales, you would see that, things are pretty low from about 2000 to about 2013. And then they start to take off, and the growth is absolutely astonishing. All the databases put together were at about 1 million in 2013. And as of the last few months, over 35 million test kits have been sold, the vast majority of them in the United States, which means that nearly 10% of the population of this country has taken a DNA test. And the reason that I mention that is because we are genetically related to many, many people, right? Third, fourth, fifth cousins. And when a cousin, maybe somebody you didn't grow up with, you don't even recognize their name, decides to take a test, they are in some ways implicating you in the technology even when you don't choose to test. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But the decisions of others and people who are essentially strangers to you to take a test means that you are essentially identifiable depending on the situation if someone is looking for you, even if you never test. And that means that DNA tests are a conversation we all need to be having, whether or not we choose to participate in the technology ourselves.
Well, I appreciate you helping us getting started in this type of conversation, although I know it's a conversation that many of us in this Zoom chat program have already started and have probably had some new discoveries as a result. Yeah. Now, I think what you referred to is the tipping point in American family genomics. So would you just go over that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this as a tipping point because there are so many people in the databases. And there's a computational scientist who's done research on this. And, basically you can identify fairly easily if you have a third cousin match. And by fairly easily, I mean you have to have some significant skills, or you might need to work with a search angel to help you. But often from a third cousin match, you can identify somebody who's not in the database. And there's so much in the US population at this point that let's say you're a person in your 40s and you have never known the identity of your genetic father. Let's say you're looking for him, you'd like to know who he is, and for whatever reason, you can't ascertain his identity. Your mom doesn't want to tell you. It's painful. She's no longer alive. It's not a conversation you can have. So your genetic father doesn't actually need to be in the database in order for you to find him through DNA testing. He could be potentially identifiable because his sister chooses to test, because his second cousin chooses to test. And let's say in the case of a second or a third cousin, I can use research techniques, genetic genealogy techniques, to look at, say, this third cousin match that I have with, on my father's side. If I'm able to ascertain that this is my paternal side, I can kind of go back and using genealogy research, I can ascertain who the most recent common ancestor is, and then come back down through time and try to find at least the level of generation and maybe the group of brothers who are potentially my father. And for that, I'm using not just genealogical materials and not just obituaries, but also things like social media. I can potentially figure out the identity of my dad, or maybe a set of three brothers, one of which is likely to be my dad. And then I can look at his Facebook account. If he's made public postings, I can sort of look him up on whitepages.com. I can read about him in whatever ways. I mean, there's very few people who don't have a digital trail at this point. And then I can quite possibly find his email address, and I can reach out to him, or I can write him a letter. And so what is happening now is there's a kind of a subset of this nation of people who have not known their genetic origins. And now they are able to find them out, and they're in the process of reaching out to their parents or their half siblings, whether because they were adopted and they were denied the capacity to know their parents' identities, they were not able to access their original birth certificates, or they were donor conceived and they're searching for the identity of their sperm donor who's anonymous, but frankly, there's no such thing as an anonymous sperm donor anymore. Or they are the product of what's known in this world as an NPE, which stands for non-paternity event, or not parent expected. Or they're from a family where there was a genetic ancestry that was covered up because of the forces of assimilation when they came to this country, or because of racial discrimination that say, pushed a Black family to pass as white. So you have all these sort of like different scenarios where a person may be searching for someone, or for better clarity about their own identity. What I wanted to explore in the book is what it looks like first to test and discover that you're not who you expected, even when you never set out to ask the question, even if you didn't have an expectation of a surprise. As in Alice's case, she had no expectation of a surprise. And then I wanted to know, what is it like then to make contact with those family members, and how does that play out? And so I did interview people, and I would interview them over the months, and then in fact over a year, and then sometimes over more than a year, to see, how do those attempts at connection work out? what does it look like to write a letter to your genetic father? How does he respond? What are all the different ways that he can respond? What does it feel like to be embraced? And what is it like to be rejected?
Now, a lot of people have taken DNA tests to shed some sort of light on their ethnic identity. In fact, it's even been marketed for that.
Right.
Now, what sort of things what happens when you have, say, a family history that you see as part of your identity, and you discover through DNA testing that this might not quite work with the narrative that you've been told? How do people deal with that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, so this whole question of the term ethnicity estimate, which is how Ancestry in particular has kind of described the little pie chart that you get that tells you how much this and that you are, which is, I should say, fairly reliable, but not exactly perfect. And we can talk about that a little bit, but it can be a little bit off at the margins, but it's pretty good, and it's good particularly in terms of geographical area, if not always precisely the distinction between, say, French and German. In a culture, perhaps there's populations that mixed, and there's war and migration, and it can be difficult to tease out, according to kind of contemporary nation state status, exactly where someone came from 500 to 1,000 years ago when the borders had different names or didn't exist. So there's this question of ethnicity, right? And kind of what is ethnicity? And there's a kind of a critique of that term within the world of genetic genealogists, which is, of course, that ethnicity is not just genetic ancestry, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what we grow up with. It's the things our parents, the nicknames they give us in the old, the Yiddish nicknames. It's the language that they use with us. It's the religion. It's the food. It's all of these things that that define identity. So should discovering that you're something other than you thought really negate or upend or supersede everything you grew up with? Okay, fine. That's a very good argument for experience. So we'll put that in one pile. On the other hand, what if your understanding of yourself is, because your family got its history wrong, as in Alice's case, or because your father's not genetically related to you, right? And there's a kind of a way in which those discoveries can often explain unanswered questions. So over and over, when I talk to people who had discovered, for instance, that one or both of their parents wasn't genetically related to them, they would talk of a very common experience of kind of going back and remembering childhood memories and interpreting them differently, of waking up in the middle of the night and saying, oh my God, that thing that happened that when I was 5 now suddenly makes sense, of kind of annotating their life in light of this new information and feeling incredibly grateful for it, even when that truth was painful. And the same thing can be true for ethnicity, right? So I write about a man named Rosario. Rosario believed that he was Sicilian. He actually grew up with a different name. He changed his name to Rosario because it was Italian, and he was so desirous of connecting with that Sicilian heritage that he even changed his name. He learned how to sing opera. He entered the Catholic Church. He married an Italian-American woman, proposed to her in Italy. He was full on with the Italian path. Now, the Sicilian narrative had come from his mother. That's what she said they were. There wasn't really anything, no language, no food, no customs that were particularly Italian, but that was what he understood that they were. Flash forward until he's in his, I think, early 50s, and he does the combination of DNA testing and genealogical research, and he realizes he's not at all Italian. He's not at all Sicilian. What's the truth? The truth is that he is part Black. And his mother who was the product of a relationship between a Black man and a white woman, had kept this from him to protect him from the racial discrimination that she had experienced as a biracial child in Vermont in the middle of the 20th century. And to say to someone like Rosario, this doesn't count, and your experience growing up is what matters, is to negate the whole of history, right? And so there's a kind of a beauty to this moment of reckoning for someone like him. Not that it's without pain, because there's a lot of bitterness too in his understanding of how his mother's family was broken apart. His Black grandfather was put in jail because of this relationship. So, you know, he's come to a sort of a different place, a different kind of orientation on this earth, I would say, and a different understanding of America because of having to grapple with the history of his own family and what it tells him about the history of America. And so sometimes, I guess what I'm trying to say in this incredibly rambling way is that it's not simple. It's not either or. And I found that over again, and I was talking to people, you know, ethnicity is neither solely your experience, nor is it solely your genetics. And family is the same way. And I think to some extent, it may be that we are coming away from that kind of binary thinking towards something more inclusive.
To collective because they're falling down. They're like called pineapple tomatito.
Victoria, would you mute your phone? Good, thank you.
There are times when people to whom I guess this hasn't happened will say something like, you know, what does it matter? So you're something other than what you thought. What does it matter? It matters a great deal. And you need only talk to, you know, any of the, frankly, at this point, millions of Americans who've had a surprise or some new understanding of themselves to see that it does really inform how we see the world, you know, and our perspective on it and our understanding of the past, which truly isn't that far away.
From reading your book, I get the idea, though, that depending on how different groups see their ethnic identity, they then interpret the DNA results in a different way. For example, you have gone about Native Americans and their reluctance for DNA testing.
Well, so membership in a Native American tribe is sort of a complicated, it's a political status. It's something that is defined by the people in it as a kind of a web of kinship. It has to do with experience and growing up with it. So the kind of issue that Elizabeth Warren had, that's who you're referencing Elizabeth.
That's right, I had forgotten her name.
Yeah, and the fact that she tested herself apparently to kind of like defend herself or validate her claims of Native American ancestry after the president had kind of attacked her with this dismissive nickname, this very derisive nickname of Pocahontas. And so, you know, she goes ahead and tests. She finds this Native American ancestry pretty far back, and but not that far back that it couldn't be detected. I think it was like 6 to 10 generations or something like that. Someone can check it. And there is a reaction within many members of the Native American community against what she had done. And the reason for that is that community defines itself not just along lines of genetic ancestry. And they have a political status that was established with the federal government that went back a very long time that they have fought for. And so something that appears to kind of threaten that status is extremely threatening. But there's also this kind of critique from sociologists that when you think only in terms of genetic ancestry, you are flattening the living experience. And I think that is true. And I think that's why it's important to think in terms of both. You know, can a result kind of shed light on your experience, particularly if it's like something like you're 25 or 50% something that you didn't realize? Certainly. But it can, you kind of have to be careful about genetic essentialism and kind of reading too much into the genes and their power to foretell. So you do see over and over this kind of human tendency to say things like, oh, I have British ancestry, no wonder I like the Beatles. Well, like everyone likes the Beatles. That's an actual real example, right? Or I have Belgian ancestry and I've always loved French fries. And there's this kind of like stereotyping that goes on, you know, in terms of how we understand that ancestry, where you can sort of see why it can be a bit dangerous to kind of over-interpret the power of our genes to kind of predict our fate. I'll just say one more thing on this. There's a kind of a human tendency towards essentialism. And by essentialism, I mean this desire to think in terms of essences, and the DNA is like kind of the perfect example of something that we want to be predictive and that we want to kind of, you know, predict our fate and tell us really more than we can. And we tend to see patterns where there are not, because we're human beings and we're storytellers and we look for patterns. And so there's a cautiousness that many sociologists who study race and ethnicity and those kinds of understandings will kind of, you know, speak about, not to read too much into the genes and their power to determine who we are, because experience is also so incredibly important. The family you grow up with is so incredibly important.
No, you're right. You've mentioned NPEs, or non-paternity events, or as some people say, not parent expected. And you've gone over this, but how common really are these?
According to the best population genetics research I've seen, it's just under 2% per generation. So what does that mean in terms of how common it is to discover a DNA surprise? If you take the two most common scenarios, one is discovering, you know, say that your father or your mother is not genetically related to you, much more likely your father. The other is discovering that you have a sibling or a half sibling you didn't know about, which can come by way of an NPE, but it can also be that you are genetically related to your father, but your father had a relationship back in high school and he conceived a child. Maybe he didn't even know it. Or maybe your father had a relationship outside of the marriage and he had a child through that. If you take those kind of two scenarios together, it's in the low single digits, conservatively speaking. And when you spread that out across 35 million people, you're talking at least 1 million people who've had one of those two scenarios. But the true number of people who are getting a DNA surprise are actually quite larger. So you're talking about people who don't know that they're adopted, and may discover by way of a test. They might not know that they're donor conceived. They might discover that they have upwards of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes as many as between 100 and 200 half siblings through the same donor, believe it or not. And then, of course, there's the cases of someone discovering that their family genetic ancestry isn't what they thought because, for instance, the family passed as white. So if you take sort of that whole category, it's much more than 1 million people. And then if you consider how a single revelation refracts across a family. So I spit into a tube, I discover that I'm not genetically related to my dad. Well, hell, that's going to have a hell of an implication for my dad's relationship with my mom. And now I've discovered that my two brothers are half brothers. And now there's another family and I've got a genetic dad over there and his children are now my half siblings. And now he's got to hash this out with his wife. So you're talking about me spitting into a tube and that revelation impacting 8, 10 people. And so when you think about the unexpected consequences of recreational DNA testing, you are talking about millions of Americans who are going through the process right now of trying to understand who they are, who their families are, what truth is really. And they're doing this with very little in the way of any formal support.
So what about the testing services? What responsibility do they have for the fact that what people may think they are getting is not necessarily what they receive?
Yeah. You know, they haven't really done much in the way of that. They don't, for instance, gather statistics, at least not statistics that they'll disclose to journalists. about surprises. It's actually very hard to even gather those because it's like, how do you categorize it? There's so many different ways of slicing and dicing that number. They do increasingly in the last year, the two major companies, which are Ancestry and 23andMe, have started putting up resource pages, which is interesting. And I think it is an acknowledgement of how common this is. So a resource page might say something like, they've always kind of, for years now, they've given a kind of a caution when you test. And that goes back for a long time. And the caution would be something like, you may encounter unexpected relatives, or you may find that things about your family aren't what you expect. But now these two major companies have put up pages that are, things like links to BetterHelp, which is like an online therapy program, or links to a genetic counselor named Brianne Kirkpatrick, who helps families deal with situations involving DNA surprises. So, you're starting to see a little bit in the way of kind of, I guess, corporate acknowledgement of this phenomenon, but they don't have any kind of formal program in place. If you call them up and you say, hey, this test is telling me I have a half sister and I don't have a half sister, they will talk to you on the phone and they will escalate your call to their special higher level of customer service, which is like the customer service for sensitive inquiries. And they'll tell you why the results are probably right. And it probably wasn't an error in lab. And in fact, you do have a half sister. But then it's up to you. Then it's up to you to figure out how you have a half sister and think about whether you want to call that half sister and email that half sister. And in many ways, this is the beginning of the journey, right? The DNA test and the discovery is just the beginning. The rest of it, the way it plays out, and all those stories, which I tried to tell in great detail and from kind of different perspectives and all the different ways it can play out, that is the thing that I think can go on for a lifetime.
Yes, and I mean, is it true that once you have your DNA in a registry, it stays there? I mean, is there anything that you can do to delete?
Yeah, you can delete it. Absolutely. You can give consent to have your DNA used in the context of genetic research. And if you've done that, you can change your mind, but if it's part of an ongoing study, it's kind of too late. But you can certainly delete your kit. You can certainly delete your agreeing to participate in any future studies. So there is that. There are privacy concerns for people about, what would happen if a database was hacked or breached. But yes, in theory, you can certainly get rid of your genetic information. It may have been shared with some third parties, or some information about you, if not your genetic information, may have been shared with, like your name and email address.
Now, we've also seen with DNA testing some dramatic implications for, say, solving cold case murders, like Golden State Killer in our area. How do people feel about their DNA test results used to solve crimes when, well, that wasn't the reason they had a DNA test?
Yeah. So in the beginning, so this was April of 2018, and people have probably followed the news of the Golden State Killer, and as a matter of fact, he was recently convicted. And he's believed to have committed at least 13 murders and at least 50 rapes. And he was a former police officer. He was a man in California. He was in his 80s when he was arrested. And this case was so cold. He had never been a suspect. Many other tips had been called in of people who were said to be, I think this could be a person of interest, and look at this guy. This particular guy's name, D'Angelo, was never called in. So there's just no way that he would have been found if not for DNA. And what the law enforcement did with the help of a genetic genealogist who was also a search angel. A search angel is somebody who helps people looking often for immediate family members sort of untangle the genetic information, put it together with genealogical research, and understand, say, the identity of their birth mother. So this was a woman, Barbara Ray Venter, who was a search angel. And I should add, they usually do this for free. And she had been working with adoptees for a long time. And what she did was she assisted them in using the same techniques that adopted persons have been using since 2011 or so, and that Alice used, and that I describe in the book. Alice used them for 2.5 years to try to understand her story. Those same techniques were then used to take crime scene DNA and put it into a third-party publicly accessible database called GEDmatch and search for genetic relatives of that person. And I should add that at this time, if you tested in 23andMe or Ancestry or MyHeritage, those big databases are not accessible to law enforcement. So this is a kind of a quasi-public third party, and it's important to make that distinction. They were able to figure out the man's identity by looking at genetic relatives, even though he was not himself a genealogist who spit into a tube and uploaded his information. He was not in the database, which is exactly what I'm trying to talk about. This idea that you can find someone even if they've never tested. And they were able to figure out his identity. And when the case first broke, there was a great deal of concern, and particularly from genetic genealogists and privacy experts, that this was, counter to the spirit of why people had uploaded their DNA, which was to do family history research. Mm-hmm. Since then, they've incorporated a process where you can opt in or opt out of that. So in theory, the only people who are participating, and there's now two databases where you can do this at, and there's a third emerging as well. In theory, the only people whose DNA is being used this way are people who've consented. There are privacy experts who say that this is sort of trampling on the Fourth Amendment. It hasn't really been tested yet, but the polling that I've seen from Americans is that they do not object to this. There's not a big hue and cry over privacy. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that the cases that have been looked at and in which genetic genealogy has been used and consumer data, DNA, this is like the worst of the worst. These are serial killers. These are, rapists and murderers, and cases that go back to the 50s and 60s in some cases, and that have been cold so long they're frozen. I think that law enforcement has been savvy in using it for that purpose, and it's also expensive, and so they've only used it for cases where there's really no other way to solve that case.
Now, I'm curious, have you taken a home DNA test?
Yeah, I've taken 3 of them.
Any surprises?
I wouldn't say surprises. I would say I've had the experience of discovery that probably an Ancestry ad would feature. Right? The Ancestry ads don't say you might discover you're the product of a non-paternity event. But they do feature stories of connection and reunion and belonging, and that has been our family's experience. So we were able to find us cousins in Sweden. My dad's grandmother came over in the 1890s from Sweden, and there was a part of the family that stayed behind. We would never have found them if not for DNA, but we found them through a DNA database, and we corresponded with his second cousin's daughter, who I guess would be my third cousin. And it turned out she was a genealogist. She had done immense research. She knew the whole family. She knew the whole story. And we decided to go to Sweden and meet her, and we did. We went last fall, back when you could still travel, and we met her mother, who's my dad's second cousin. It was a language barrier because we don't speak Swedish and she didn't speak English, and so her daughter was kind of translating, and it was really cool. We got to see my grandmother's farm. We got to see her school, her church, the poverty that she grew up with, the reason that she left. And that was a really kind of profound experience. And I keep that in mind when I talk about DNA testing, because of course there are cautionary tales, and there are beautiful moving tales. And there's so many ways in which we have not left the past behind. It informs who we are, and we are just now starting to reckon with it. we're sort of in a grand moment of reckoning, I would say. And I think that Americans have increasingly become a nation of what I call seekers, right? People trying to understand their own identities by better understanding the past. I see it only growing. And I guess we're in a moment where we're trying to understand what the truths of the past can tell us about who we are now.
And what advice do you have for someone like me who's never taken a home DNA test? I've studied my family genealogy years back. I think I know my lineage.
Are you inclined to take one?
No, I think I'll leave it for the next generation.
Yeah. So my advice would be stick with that, because there's a genetic genealogist named Cece Moore who was asked at she gave a talk that I went to, and someone was asking her something along the lines of like, how do we convince those relatives whose DNA we know holds the key to figuring out the identity of a great-great-grandfather, right? How do we convince them to test when they're resistant? And she said, we don't. Because if people are hesitant, there may be a reason why they're hesitant. If they test and they find out something they weren't ready to find, it's not going to be good for the reputation of our field. Mm-hmm. And that made a lot of sense to me. People may not be a concern about family, it may be a concern about privacy, right? And the possibility of genetic discrimination, or the possibility of what happens to that data if a company like Ancestry or a company like 23andMe gets sold to another company 10 years from now, and we can't even anticipate what that would look like or what their privacy and consent policies would look like. So that's one way of answering your question. The other way of answering your question is that, as I've spoken about, increasingly, it's not a question of if genetic family secrets are going to come out, but when, right? If you are in possession of a secret about your child, so you're in your 80s and your child's in her 60s, and she was donor conceived and she doesn't know, the advice I would have would be to consider how you might have a conversation with her about that. Because it is far better to find out from the lips of a loved one than because you decide to test and you find out that way by way of a computer screen. Over and over, people tell me that. And so the advice is not so much for those of us who have not tested whether we should test. The advice is for the keepers of those genetic secrets.
We'll have some questions in a minute, but Libby, can you tell us how you can get a hold of your book?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I'm happy to answer that question. So The Lost Family is available wherever. Amazon, if you want to do it that way and get it quickly. If you want to support independent bookstores, I would really recommend bookshop.org, which came together only in the last, 6 months, maybe. And they're shipping books from local bookstores, and they're helping keep them open during the pandemic. And that's really important. And if you want the experience of a virtual book signing and you want a book signed to you or to someone you love, there's a shop near my house called the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. And if you call them, the owner of the shop is named Jennifer. And if you tell her, I want a book and I want to order a book and have it shipped to me and made out to Donnie, I will happily, go there and sign it, and I'll ship it to you and you can have that. So that's, a couple different ways. Thanks for asking.
And of course, it's available in your library. We have a number.
Yeah, oh, thank you. It's available in the library. Yeah. Curbside pickup, right?
That's right. Curbside pickup and ebook. It's available as an ebook now, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Does anyone have any particular questions for Libby or comments?
Let's see. We have maybe something in the chat. Let's see.
Well, if you want to ask a question, please unmute.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Mention your first name and your question.
I can kind of continue to babble, and if someone wants to raise their hand so that I can see and stop talking in time for you to ask your question, I certainly can do that. Lucille, do you want to just keep talking? Do you have questions that you
Sure, I do have another question, and that is in terms of where you see the DNA home test kit industry going. Is it falling off? Is it moving on? What type of new research do you think DNS, do you see anything on the horizon that you really feel is going to be a new breakthrough with the data that home DNA testing has come up with?
So I was talking about that chart, like if you could, like the kind of growth from 2013 to now being quite steep. And in the last 9 months, the growth of these tests has slowed. And the thinking is that that the companies have kind of vacuumed up all the early adopters who were willing to pay $99 or less to augment their family history research with the DNA test. And so the major companies have started to pivot to health and wellness traits related information. And so that is something that we're seeing in terms of the industry kind of growing and turning towards health related testing. There's also a bit of a convergence between, and I wonder maybe what we should do is mute everyone, because I think they may be hearing a lot of background noise, as I know I am. All right, I'm unmuted. And then if they want to talk, they can say something in the chat, they can raise their hand and I'll stop talking to take a question. Whatever makes sense, however you want to get my attention. So you're seeing a kind of a convergence between the medical industry, right, your doctor, and recreational DNA testing, to where company like Ancestry or MyHeritage is now offering, your doctor or some doctor give you a prescription for a test that's going to look into your predisposition for certain diseases. And then there might be someone to provide a little bit of guidance when you get your results, like a genetic counselor or a physician's network. And so you're sort of seeing the medical establishment come together with recreational DNA testing. And that's an interesting kind of glimpse of the future, I think.
Well, I'll ask, I thought Alice's story was really interesting. And I was especially interested in the relationship with the one cousin, is it Peter, that she found that she developed a bond with, that then turned out actually not to be a genetic relative at all. And yet that relationship remained. And I thought that was really interesting.
I don't want to put Alice on the spot if she doesn't want to talk.
Yeah, so, but if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I'll talk, and Alice, if you want to chime in, that's cool, and otherwise I'll just chat. I can talk forever. But yeah, I mean, Pete Nolan, I love the story of Pete Nolan, and if you haven't read the book, there's like kind of a lovely tale of how Alice came to know him, and it involves this moment of kismet and these crossed letters and like a sister in an orphanage matching them up, and it's like it's really, really cool. But I think, Alice's relationship with Pete, who she knows of as a cousin and is certainly family to her, and yet as you see in the book, not genetically related after all, and his DNA is incredibly important to the resolution of her case. And I should say that her story is not explained. Her surprising DNA results, the reason that it's so compelling and that you want to kind of like, that I made it the spine of the book, the narrative spine interspersing other stories, is because the explanation for her surprising results is not any of these scenarios that are more common, right? She's not the product of an NPE. She's not adopted. She's not donor conceived. She's not the result of a family that hid their genetic ancestry when they emigrated. But these are all theories that she thought were possible explanations, because they're much more common and much more to be expected than the ultimate explanation. So as you travel through the narrative, you get to see Alice theorizing that maybe X is the explanation, or Y, or Z. And as she eliminates that theory, you get to see what it looks like when it plays out in the life of somebody else, when it is in fact a case of a non-paternity event or not parent expected. But what I loved about the story about her relationship with Pete is it tells so many things at once about how we define family, how we can define it very narrowly if we think about it only in terms of genetics. But when it comes to the heart, family is much bigger than genetics. We've always known that. But I think that DNA testing underscores it. It forces us to think about all the relationships that we think of as family, of people close to us that we value incredibly deeply, for whom biology is just, it does not matter. And so, so yeah, I love the story of Pete. I think that's a beautiful story. And I was very glad that he was willing to talk to me. He's a very private man. So I was honored that he was willing to share his story with me.
Yes, it is a wonderful story. And Alice, I want to thank you for making your story available to Libby so that it could be told. I ask, of all the people you interviewed, what was your favorite story? Now, you may have already mentioned that, and Alice is certainly a compelling story, but is there any other person who stands out?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Alice's story is my favorite. There's an incredible story in the book about a woman named Linda. Linda is in the process of a medical crisis when she decides to do DNA testing. She believes that she may have, I believe it's ovarian cancer. And part of what informs her, her belief that she may have cancer, in addition to symptoms, in addition to pain, in addition to a test that indicates that sort of like is unclear but vague enough that it indicates that she may have it. What informs it is her family history. So her mother had a hysterectomy. There's some other issues in the family that suggest that she could be experiencing cancer, and the fact that she is of half Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. And when she takes all of that data to her doctor, together, of course, with the symptoms that she's experiencing, the bloating and the pain and the examination, the doctor says, you know, that the doctor does, the doctor says, yes, like, let's go for it. Let's not wait. Let's do an emergency hysterectomy right now and not wait for things to play out. She does an ancestry test around this time because she's trying to determine exactly how much Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry she has, because there can be an elevated risk of particular kinds of cancer depending on if you have Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. And it is after she has the hysterectomy and after she's recovering that she gets her results from the ancestry test and discovers that she is adopted. She does not have any Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry because she is not genetically related to her mom or her dad. And it's completely a blow. Her mother is alive, by the way, I should say, and did not tell her when she sought her mother out for advice on getting a family history, a health history. And the story is sort of incredibly complicated by that, what to her is very much a betrayal. She reaches out to her father, she figures out who her genetic father is. She reaches out to him and he's like, listen, you seem very nice, but these phone calls are getting me in trouble with my wife. And she keeps trying to kind of reach out to him, and he ultimately has his attorney send her a discontinuance of contact letter, which is essentially a letter saying, stop reaching out to me, I don't want a relationship with you. She reaches out to the family of her genetic mom, and she finds that the woman has just died, so she can never ask her genetic mother questions. You know, what did you think of me all these years? Did you ever try to look for me? These are things that impinge on her. You know, she feels, the way she described it to me is she felt again like she was a 6-year-old child, right? All those feelings of wanting to be loved, of feeling rejected by the adults in her life. All of a sudden she was a child again, and all she wanted was to know that her mom had maybe not wanted to give her up, had maybe searched for her, had thought of her every day, and she could not ask her mom because her mom was no longer alive. And when she reached out to her half siblings on her mother's side, they were in grief, and they were trying to process what she was telling them, which was something that their own mother had never said. So imagine yourself, you're in grief, your mother died 6 months ago, a woman approaches and says, hi, I'm your half sister, I'm your older half sister, your mother had a baby she never told you about, and she gave that baby up for adoption. I'd like to have a relationship with you. And they don't. It is too painful, it's too jarring, and people in those situations sometimes just deny. They just deny it. And it can be easy to deny, because if you're not matched up in a database, if those people didn't test, you know, the person has done some genetic detective work. You don't know how reliable it is. Maybe they're wrong. There are cases where people do it wrong for sure. I don't believe that that's the case for her, but the siblings basically just said, stop reaching out to us. And so Linda was left really bereft. You know, she had in many ways felt much worse about her relationship with her mother, the woman who raised her, for her never having told her that she was adopted, and then she could not find a home with either her mother's side of the family or her father's side of the family. And I think that story is important because there are a lot of stories about DNA testing, and a lot of them revolve around happy reunions. You see those in the newspaper a lot. I found my mother, I found my sister, we're all, you know, I found my 20 siblings through the same donor father, and we get together and we have potlucks. And those stories happen, and I tell them in the book, but there's a lot of stories where it's much more complicated, and there's no one to blame for that. It's just that we've all suddenly been thrust into this like unexpected moment of reckoning. And there are often people on the other side of those reckonings who really don't want to be sought out. They're in really difficult positions. And you wish for these people that there were mediators. You wish that there were mental health professionals, and there are, but only a handful starting to specialize in DNA surprises. But I think we need more of that. You know, yeah.
You've given us a lot to think about, especially about home DNA testing and its results and how we might think about family and our heritage. This concludes our program for today. I want to thank you all for coming. A special call out from my colleague Deborah Stryker for her technical support. All of you stay safe and well, and have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.